Welcome back to Inside the Studio. I'm Joanne Pollock and I'm here this morning with Florence Marino in her home in Waterloo, Ontario. So great to be here, Florence, and thank you so much for allowing me an opportunity into a world which is truly beautiful and historical. So I want to just start for a minute and talk about putting your art form into historical perspective. So do you want to sort of talk a little bit about the history of illuminated manuscripts?
Sure, yeah. Well, basically, all books had to be made by somebody before the printing press. And it really started in terms of the Western tradition with a lot of religious texts, but it moved on to poems and all manner of books. What I like to do, I look at and use as examples from books about these old texts to be able to recreate and do them my way, if you want to call it that. And so I've gone to places to look at old manuscripts and looked at like turning the pages on some of these books, and it's just been really inspirational. It's unbelievable. But some of the examples I use, so that I can kind of show you, the Lindisfarne Gospel. That's an old. They date it to just before 722. Mm-hmm. So it really goes back quite a long way.
Very.
And the detail in those times, especially when the materials they had to use were like quill pens and very, very fine, you had to cut the quill pen in order to make that very, very fine point, and dipping in ink and making the ink. So really quite hard craft to be able to do it so perfectly and so beautifully. But as you know, monks did it, so they had a lot of time.
So they did, and the purpose of the illuminated manuscripts were, of course, they were alluring, and for the masses of people that were illiterate. This was one way of getting their attention and telling a story. Mm-hmm. And so they did practice their craft in monasteries, and I understand that some nuns actually were allowed to do the craft as well. Mm-hmm. And so they often used incorporated gold and silver into the pieces to add further allure, right? Yeah. So the Book of Hours is very important in the history of illuminated manuscripts, as is, you've mentioned, the Book of Kells, which is in Dublin College in Ireland, and the Lindisfarne Gospels. If you're an art history student, every art history student has studied the Lindisfarne Gospels. So let's talk about Florence for a moment.
Okay.
So you are a native New Yorker?
Yeah, born in Brooklyn.
Born in Brooklyn.
Yeah, youngest of 8 children. Grew up in New York and came to Canada. Went to university here and then just kind of stayed. So I'm the only one in my family that's here in Canada, but I'm really happy to be here, especially in these times.
You're one of 8 children, and it sounds to me like you come from a very artistic family, dating back on both sides of your family lineage. So your grandfather, and you have brought some work, or you have some work here this morning, which I would love to talk about.
Okay.
So what was your grandfather's name?
George Craig.
George Craig.
Yeah, and George Craig was my mother's father. He was a fireman in New York City, and when he was hanging around the firehouse when there weren't any fires, he would be always working on a big piece that he was usually commissioned to do. And one of the things he did quite a lot was he would chronicle the careers of the big chiefs. When they would retire, they would be presented with this testimonial of their career. And so he would work on these really elaborate testimonials for these chiefs. And his work was hanging in my house when I was a kid. And I looked at his work and I started to do his hand. I started to do letters how he did them. And this is an example. This is a shell. My mother grew up in Queens. My grandfather grew up in Queens. And they went to Rockaway Beach all the time, and they would pick these shells up. And he would do his calligraphy on shells, for smaller things. And when I was a kid, this was in my house, and I did this probably when I was maybe about 10 or 12 years old. I just started to do some of his, try to recreate some of his work. So that's an example. And I continued to do things like that. I do wedding invitations for family or poems. But it came a point as I got into my adult life, I just didn't have a lot of time to be able to do bigger pieces like poems and measure everything out and get it centered and everything else. So I started to do single letters. I started to do the illuminated letters. And I got all kinds of books, which I used as inspiration. This might be an example. So I can kind of show you this is kind of the work that I did, but I'll show you the book I used just to give you an idea how I changed things. This would be the same letter, the original kind of letter. There were people in it, and there were animals distributed, and there would have been other words and things like that. So I kind of change it the way I want to see it.
Absolutely beautiful.
And add in, these were sort of like rosettes that I put in instead of the people in those circles. And I did a different treatment of how the letter was filled in and that kind of thing. But I do, before I start a letter, I usually look through all my books. And part of the process is like paging and paging and paging through these books and looking at them and thinking, what am I going to do now? What's inspiring me? What's going to make me do something? And I used to think of the person I was making the letter for. And I would think about them to be able to choose the style of the letter I wanted to do for them. But then when I started doing this sort of local studio tour in my neighborhood, I didn't have the luxury of thinking of who the person was. So my system was that I would do 2 full alphabets for each show, and I would just go in order and do 2 A's and 2 B's and 2 C's and 2 D's and work through the alphabet. And all I did was say, what do I feel like doing now? Which style do I like? What would I like to execute? And so I have a lot of different examples, a lot of variety as well. A lot of what people like about my work is that it's so diverse. These two are very similar, actually. I'll show you a different one, maybe that you could.
This is a piece actually that I bought at your studio tour, Florence, a couple of years ago, and very attracted to the piece for a number of reasons. In its simplicity, for one thing, and the elegance of the piece as well. Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so I choose the letters. They can be all kinds of different letters. This one's an example. This is the example in here, and then this is how I kind of executed on it. So sometimes I add things or add lines or change the way they look, but use it as an inspiration.
Now, in terms of the choice of color composition, are you in any way sort of honoring the traditional aspect of color?
I don't know. I do use modern pens and things like that. One of the things I would like to do when I have more time, when I retire, and do this a little bit more frequently, is I would like to do the gilding, and I would like to use the materials, the actual materials that were used, just to see how that would look. And I'm sure it would be even more brilliant.
I'm sure it would be. No doubt about that. It would absolutely zing with life.
Yeah.
Right.
But some of this is very, what I use to make the colors is I use very fine permanent ink pens that people use for anime. And I will often use white to then bleed that color out so that it then softens it. And you can see that as an example in this particular bead.
So how long would it take you to do a letter like this?
This one, it's hard to say because it would be after work and at night, a couple of hours a week, or a couple of hours a night. Probably for about, this one would probably have taken me 3 weeks of that amount of time.
Wow.
So probably this one would be around 20 hours, maybe 25 hours to do this. And part of my process, the part that slows me down is that paging and paging and paging piece, because I often will spend several hours just figuring out what I want to do. And then once I start, it goes quickly because somehow it just keeps going and going. And once you're sitting there and doing it, you can get lost in it. And it's very meditative, it's very calming, and it helps you sort of tune everything else out, which is kind of nice.
We are going to enjoy a demonstration from you shortly, but I do want to tell you how much I love this process and this work. So let's continue on with a beautiful demonstration. You can talk about the tools that you're using, and you can talk about your color composition. I feel very privileged to be able to watch you do your art form this morning. And I know that you were sitting at a very important desk.
Yeah, actually this desk, my grandfather built for my mother, and it was in my house. And this was the desk that I would sit at when I was a kid to actually do my grandfather's hand. So it really has a lot of meaning to me. And can you imagine being my mother, looking at her daughter doing what her dad would always do.
Beautiful.
At this desk that he made for her. So
Beautiful.
Kind of neat. Yeah.
Family treasure. So tell us what you're going to do.
Okay, sure. Well, I have just thought I'd tell you about the pens I use. Many of them, I have all kinds of different colors, but basically these are pens that are very fine lines. And so if you take a ruler, and I often will use a ruler for like a straight edge, when you use a ruler, you can do a really nice line. And it doesn't bleed underneath. It's very, very precise. So it can be very, for me, I like a lot of detail. I tend to focus on that. So I find that to be one of the best attributes of these pens. I also use metallic pens that are like just these jelly roll pens. They're also Japanese. A lot of the inks that I like to use are Japanese. And this is a little bit more gloppy, but the thing I like about it is it really is brilliant. So if you look at, say, how this metallic pen brings out this gold, it really is almost as good as, maybe not as good as, really gilding. It is a bit of a shortcut in the sense that I would love to learn how to gild and do the actual process that the monks did when these things were done.
Now, your grandfather wasn't using gel pens.
No,
what was your grandfather using?
My grandfather used pens like this. So, and when I started, that's what I used. I would use these types of pens and dip them in ink. So, just like a quick example, you would dip it in ink. That's the one thing about, That's the one thing about ink. you have to be really careful. Oops, sorry. You have to be really careful because it blotches. So let's just do a little curly Q here. It blotches, and so you can't put too much ink on these pens. But anyway, I would do all my work with this type of pen before I discovered these.
Oh my gosh. So why you didn't go blind?
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is that it can be very messy. And as a kid, I can remember knocking over the ink bottle right on the work that I had just done. And so I remember my brother actually did a trick for me. He got a piece of oak tag, and he took the ink bottle, drew a circle around it, and then cut it like a pizza, and then put the ink bottle inside to hold it up so that it wouldn't tip over when I was doing my work. Okay, so what I will often do is I do the letter, outline it first, which I had already done on this one, and then I essentially color it in with whatever I'm doing. So my theory here is I'm going to color in the M with my gold pen. The hard part with this is, like you say, you have to get it really close up to the outline, but you can't seep over top because then you'll cover it.
Right.
And so often I have to take my glasses off because I'm kind of blind. And I go really, really close down to get to the exact spot so that I'm not gonna go over top of the black line.
Wow. You need a pretty steady hand, Florence.
Well, that's the thing. I think all those years of training has helped me on that.
Discipline. Wow.
So that's kind of the gold part. On this letter, what I'd like to do is do some white dots in amongst. I'm still undecided about how I'm going to execute on this letter. So I often will do, to make a color, I'll start with, say, red, and I'll, kind of say I'm doing like a petal or a leaf or whatever. I'll bleed it out
Right.
with the white.
Beautiful. That's the artistry process.
And then if I need more white, there's a type of pen that's almost like you paint over top of it. It's this one here. And what I often do before I start anything is I always do that so that I can bleed these things out. So this might be kind of a different approach. But I'm not entirely sure I want to do color on this one. I want to have the gold, but I want to have white dots. So my thinking on this is I'll pick a spot here and I'll show you what I'm thinking. So I want to do dots.
And then bleed out the color?
I don't know if I want color. I might just want white. Using the page as the color.
I see, okay.
But I'm not sure because it's not cooperating just yet. So it's almost like you have to look at it and see, am I doing what I want to do here? Does it need something else? Sometimes the simplest things are actually the nicest.
I agree.
But it's hard to call this stuff simple, right? Because this is like gilding.
Oh yes, very elaborate. Very elaborate.
But you can see sort of the white coming up and giving texture to this. And dots are kind of one of the things too that brings out depth.
For the amount of cost involved versus labor, you know, it's incalculable, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just want to leave us with an interesting quote that I read, that actually calligraphy work is the work of an angel and not of a human. And in many respects, it has been that way, where it's kind of a divine hand that is allowing you to create beautiful things. So thank you for taking the time with me this morning. If people are interested in commission work from you, how best do they get a hold of you to do that?
Well, I have an email address, fmcalligraphy@gmail.com.
And phone, are people able to phone you?
Sure, my number's 519-570-4181.
Awesome. Well, thank you ever so much for an incredible opportunity today to spend time with you. And I wish you much success. I know you're busy right now with a whole other profession, but I think in time, we'll look for great things to come forward from Florence Marino.
Well, thank you, Joanne, and thank you for the opportunity. It's been great having you here, and you have some really great insights. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.